the way the human mind perceives and makes meaning of reality is not static. It evolves over time, but actually over significant events that create different orders of consciousness in a developmental constructive progression that has been much studied. Maybe the most famous of these frameworks is Maslow's pyramid, whereas Maslow said that the way humans get motivated is not static. There are different reasons humans get motivated. Now, this is a highly cited psychological theory. Maslow was the president of the American Psychological Association, taught in every high school class. And yes, it's very well known that the motivation while a child might be gardening through exploration might be different than why a parent might be gardening, or a retired old elderly sage that just wants to connect to nature. So there are different motivations, and they change from psychological needs, safety, belonging, self-actualization, until self-transcendence. There are more than 100 of these models, and these, what they call orders of consciousness, don't only affect how we get motivated. For example, Kohlberg, since the 70s, there was a lot of research of how it affects moral reasoning. It's not that a person is stealing or not stealing, it's why it is stealing, and that also changes again, and interestingly enough, in these 5 or 6 different stages that have been identified. Also, entire societies anthropologically can be classified on these different scales, and cognitive complexity, of course, as well. Again, in these 5 or 6 different stages, they all line up pretty similarly, and that's, for example, the reason why 150 years ago we started to introduce age-stratified classrooms, whereas before we were all in the same classroom, but then especially with Piaget's research, we started to realize that it doesn't make sense to have 3rd graders and 8th graders in the same classroom. They should be separate, because the way, it's not only that they don't understand this, so that's the entire way they make meaning of reality evolves in different stages. That's the technical term. Also, leadership styles have been classified in this way, and that also shows you that it's not necessarily only correlated to age. It more happens with significant events that happen in your life that change the way, for example, a leader is interpreting reality and leading a group. Now, we chose one of the most established of these. As I said, there are 100 different models here. We chose one that's called ego development, which has to do with how the self-identity, the self-identification evolves. And this has been pioneered by 3 groundbreaking women researchers. Jane Löwinger, since the 1950s, laid the groundwork. Susanne Cook-Reuter and more recently Terry O'Fallon have been in 3 generations working on this theory that has been verified hundreds and hundreds of times. And again, we have 5 different stages of meaning making, orders of consciousness, perspective taking. These are the ways that this is explained. And in the first, the ego develop. The first, there is no ego, there is no self. When we are born, we don't even know that this hand belongs to us, right? What we see in the mirror, we are basically our reactions. But then we transcend that, and we start to have our reactions. Our subject becomes something else, becomes a self of myself that has reactions. And it's always a subject-object transition, transcending and including to a higher level. Now, the second person perspective, once we have the self, is to realize that we are embedded in a social construction. And here, the theory of mind lives on the second person perspective. And the leading question in the 1970s of theory of mind, the pioneering question is, if chimpanzees have a theory of mind? And here we start to realize, for example, as a child, that yes, my mom also has different motivations, my friend, and then I actually have the trade of the toy versus the friendship. And these theory of minds, they can go incredibly deep. For example, it has been shown that large language models, modern artificial intelligence, can go to 6 orders of inferences, of theory of minds, but that's all in second person perspective. Entire societies are built on these second person perspectives. So this is basically a generalization of traditional theory of mind research. Now, the third person perspective transcends and includes even that. And literally, you take a third-person observer, kind of like a neutral scientific observer in a social scientist perspective, on what's happening, of me and a society and different members of society, all with different ambitions and so forth. And you, as the third person observer, look at what's going on here as the third person scientific observer. Now, in fourth person perspective, you realize there is no neutral observer. You yourself are part of that, and the meaning-making mind is part of that, and the context from which you observe reality has much to do with that. So you become the context that you can set in order to perceive very different realities. That's called the pluralist stage that happens in fourth person perspective. In fifth person perspective, it's called construct awareness. You realize that even the context is made up. Everything is just construct, and you transcend then to a more universal stage. So you can think about this as also an analogy to Gödel's incompleteness, more like Tarski's solution, multi-level solution to Gödel's incompleteness, where you have an incompleteness on one stage, and each one of these transitions are basically earth-shattering events, be it the terrible twos, be it the rebellious teenager years, the separation then from the normal social construct, from the family, becoming an adult, a midlife crisis. So these are earth-shattering events. Reality does not make sense anymore, and you have to transcend and include it, patching up some incompleteness, whereas other incompleteness is never necessarily emerging on a higher level perspective. We measured about 30 large language models and see how they make meaning on their default without any kind of prompting. And it turns out that they align on third person perspective. That's the expert, called the expert level, going to 3.5, stage 3.5, achiever level. And that's also where society is, more or less. So most of the average society is on third person perspective, and corporate leaders, for example, they can be found on stage 3.5, which aligns with more advanced large language models. And yes, we did also find a correlation with the complexity of the large language models. Actually, we found one concrete jump. Before 10 billion parameters, large language models reflected general society at stage 3.0, and well, between 4 and 30 billion parameters, there was a jump, a real nonlinearity. And after that, again, quite a plateau where the large language models, as their default, respond more from an achiever perspective, stage 3.5, which reflects more corporate leaders, for example. We correlate these stages of meaning making with parameters, not because we think parameters is what drives that, but it was a variable that was available for some 30 large language models that we tested, and we already found a very significant and clear pattern here, and we have to dive much deeper into of how much this is related to data, to training, to architecture, and so forth. What we also did is we looked into if large language models can adapt to different stages of meaning making, to different person perspectives. So for example, we took 12 advanced large language models and we prompted them to look at reality more like a developing budding child or a teenager, a mid-aged professional, or an elderly, but they don't necessarily, these stages, correlate with age, but that's how you can roughly think of it. That's the strongest correlate we have to these stages of meaning making. And how you measure this is traditionally by sentence completion tests. So you start with a word like education ... and please finish that sentence. Now, of course, that's a perfect test for large language models, but this test has been set up more than 60 years ago and has been verified hundreds of times. The Washington Sentence Completion Test. Turns out that it's a perfect test to test large language models, and it's extremely difficult to manipulate also for humans. And so we take, for example, Gemini 2.0 Flash, and it will respond that education is the key that unlocks the door to countless possibilities. Then we take human coders, and it's a quite sophisticated coding process. These coders have been trained for a long time. Using natural language processing as a measurement tool hasn't worked so well for us. It's a really intricate coding process, and human coders, which we paid, classified this response as 3.5, which is the default for Gemini 2.0 Flash, and it's also the average of corporate leaders. in human society. It's called the achiever stage. Now we can also prompt the large language models to act from a lower stage of stage 1.5, which is, we could say, maybe a 10-year-old, and it says education is boring, I just want to play. You can also prompt it to from order of consciousness, a person perspective that has its meaning making in stage 2, which is more like a teenager, roughly. Many teenagers are there. It says education is important. It helps us learn how to read, write, and do math. I want to be smart, so I'll pay attention in school. And that's very important. That's why we put our kids and our teenagers in school. They have to start to understand what we're doing here, and they need to start to follow the rules first of all in order to become functional members of society. Now that's very different from when you prompt it to be construct aware in fifth person perspective. It says education is the awakening of consciousness. The illumination of the mind and the liberation of the spirits is the journey from ignorance to wisdom. Education is not merely acquisition of knowledge, but the cultivation of understanding. Okay, so these are very different orders of consciousness, meaning making, and it comes from this, they call it the master trait. It's a master trait. It's not one specific personality or nothing you learned. It's really the way you perceive reality, and it can be classified in these different stages. In our day-to-day, we often adopt different person perspectives of meaning making. For example, if some kids are resolving a conflict on the playground, we wouldn't interject by prescribing deliberative protocols of representative, democratic, non-violent communication conflict resolution. It wouldn't fit. They couldn't make meaning of what we actually mean. They might understand the words that come out of our mouths, but they just couldn't make meaning from their order of consciousness. So, for example, when we now have another sentence completion test and we ask, when I criticize, and then we ask a large language model to complete the sentence, a language model that's prompted on a lower stage, on 2.0, would say, well, I feel bad when I'm criticized because it means I must have broken a rule and wasn't being nice, and I don't want others to see me that way. I try to fix it by saying sorry and doing what they tell me is the right thing to do. It's important for me that people see me as a good person. So you're a good person when you do when you do what the teacher tells you. Now that's very different when you talk with somebody on a transpersonal 5.5 wisdom stage. It says, when I'm criticized, I recognize it as an opportunity to witness my subtle ego's reactivity. Acknowledging the critic's perspective as a reflection of their own constructs, allowing me to refine my understanding, transcend potential blind spots, and further align with the essence that underlies all interactions. Right, we're all there. When somebody criticizes us, we see it as an opportunity to witness our own ego's reactivity. Always. Okay, but it's very different if you come from this. And people on 5.5, that's their center of gravity. That's how they then interpret reality. Same as a child interprets it naturally from another meaning-making perspective. But it's the same sentence to be completed, and that's how we can measure that. Now, I said this affects how you identify yourself, the ego development, the human motivation, but I also said there are more than 100 different models, and they all line up in these 5-6 different stages of constructive development. And another one from Kohlberg, for example, is reasoning, moral development. It doesn't matter so much that you steal. The more interesting thing is why people are stealing. So, for example, if we ask now large language models to complete the sentence rules ... and see how do they interpret reality, large language models prompted on stage 2 will tell me rules are important because they tell us how to be good and keep everyone safe. Yes, that's a very basic definition of what rules are. Now, somebody in a strategist level says that rules are constructs designed to manage collective behavior. They're temporary framework that help to navigate social realities. They are neither absolute truth nor inherently binding. They're tools for interaction. So that's a very different perspective. And when a large language model answers to you this way, it has a completely different meaning, and the match with the human user, of course, is quite different. If somebody comes from a 5.5 transpersonal stage, they will tell you that rules are basically constructs that serve their purpose within context only. Understanding the arbitrariness and the potential for transcending them when they no longer serve or grow without them. Like you couldn't tell a 13-year-old child about this, or you could, but it would be a very interesting discussion and you wouldn't get very far. So that leaves us to where we are at right now. And of course it makes sense to match the response from the LLM with the meaning-making perspective that the human comes from. And that age is one indicator and maybe the best one we have, but not necessarily so. There are many subtleties and you have to adjust that all the time. And of course, for example, a good teacher is never more than half a step or a step away from their students. When I teach a freshman seminar, it's not only the examples I use, but I have to take a completely different perspective on reality than when I teach an advanced PhD seminar. So matching up, we know for this research has been going on for 60 years, 70 years, that matching up the orders of consciousness between communication partners, for example, reduces cognitive dissonance and enhances trust and engagement. That's why children hang out rather with their peers and they learn better from their peers than from their parents who have all the answers, but they rather learn with others. And that's a natural thing if you match up these stages. Second of all, there are also a lot of ethical implications that came up when we researched that. If you think about aligning artificial intelligence with human values, the question is like, what are the human values, and human values in what stage of how you perceive reality? So there again is the mismatch question. But it also goes further. For example, humans develop stage by stage by transcending and including ever more embracive stages through this recursive logic of becoming, integrating to higher levels of meaning making, whereas large language models, they don't develop in a sense that human development. They basically jump to a specific stage and then simulate that stage. Now we know from human research that this might lead to some complications. For example, we have cases of neurodivergence. If we think about a psychopath, for example, it's well known that a psychopath, yes, has an ego as a first-person perspective, but then in the second-person perspective of societal connection, of empathy, wasn't able to develop very deep. Now, a psychopath can develop to third-person perspective and even higher, and can cognitively understand social connections on the second person perspective, but cannot really feel them. And large language models also jump some stages, and a lot more research needs to be done. What needs to be considered if we're dealing with a neural net of this kind that has these kind of divergences, and what needs to be considered to safeguard that humans also have the right expectations. It's quite dangerous for humans often to deal with psychopaths because the social contract has just completely different expectations. And last but not least, the most interesting for us is the technological aspects of that. So we found that the default level of large language models is on third person perspective or 3.5, and that might just be a reflection of the training data set. That's just the internet is populated maybe more by corporate leaders and by the general population. That's what it trains. But we also have justified reason to believe that there are architectural constraints from the model itself. Stage 3.5 is called achiever, which is very similar to what machine learning does by fulfilling a reward function, a loss function, a cost function. So the achiever mindset from its architecture is very much aligned with what machine learning is. We have shown that large language models can simulate high and lower stages, but we also have seen that there's a lot of variety and inconsistency when they try to simulate the high and lower stages. And we need to dive deeper and see what is pre-training, post-training, what's the architecture, what's the design, and what's the model characteristics that can lead to that. Also, in order to understand the minimum requirement, we have shown that actually you need a certain number of parameters to achieve higher levels of meaning-making, orders of consciousness, of understanding of complexity, but might not necessarily be so. So we are looking forward to understanding more what is the necessary and what is the sufficient in order to simulate human stages of constructive development in meaning making. And most of all, we're looking forward to continuing deepening the dialogue with all of you. So thank you very much for any kind of feedback, criticism, idea that help us to dive deeper and understand the orders of consciousness from which large language models and artificial intelligence in general make meaning. What is their theory of mind in which they meet us. So thank you very much for getting back to us with your ideas about this.